Hey everyone, and welcome to Risky Business. My name's Patrick Gray, and we've got an absolutely terrific show for you all today. There's been plenty of InfoSec news, cybersecurity news over the last week or so, and for those who are looking to get their mind off the US election, boy, do we have a terrific show for you all. So I'll be talking with Adam Boileau in just a moment, and we're also going to hear this week from Sophos's CISO, Ross McKercher, who's going to talk to us about how they dropped like kernel rootkits essentially on Chinese APT researchers who were doing exploit development against their products. I'm sure a lot of you listening to this and watching this would have seen that report mentioned in the media over the last few days. So we're going to hear from him on that. And then in this week's sponsor interview, we're chatting with HD Moore, who is the chief executive and co-founder of RunZero. And he'll be talking about some new tricks that RunZero's picked up in terms of being able to marry internal asset discovery scanning with external asset discovery scanning. That's all very interesting stuff, and it's coming up later. But first, yes, Adam, it is time to talk through the week's news. And we're going to actually start with a story that I don't know, man. I just found it interesting, right? So I want to lead with it. It's proper, security geekery here. But let's talk about this Okta bug where under certain circumstances, you could just enter a username, whack enter, and get access. And I'm just going to say right off the bat, it's not quite as bad as it sounds. But yeah, walk us through what actually happened here.
Yeah, this bug is a good time. So one of Okta's features is that you can have your Okta authentication stack glued to your existing on-premise auth source. So if you've got Active Directory or LDAP, you can basically run up a thing inside your environment to its machine that will connect back out to Okta and will then forward authentication requests from Okta onwards to your internal directory. They had a bug in this process where essentially they cache the authentication requests so that they can operate when the connection to the on-premise kind of interface drops, so that you can still authenticate stuff on the network. And that caching process stored like a bcrypt hash of the username and password so that it could verify them offline. And unfortunately, no one who wrote this thought about the fact that bcrypt actually has an upper limit to how long a bcrypt hash can be, which is about 50-ish characters, up 50 to 70, depending on the implementation exactly. But yeah, the result was you could turn up, enter a 50-character username, match an existing cache entry, and be authenticated.
Yeah.
Which, when you're an authentication product like Octor, clearly is not what you want. But as you said, like it does have a few things that have made this mostly a curiosity rather than a practical thing. Like, so you had to be single factor, the connection between Okta and the on-premise agent had to be not functional or denied of service or whatever else. And then you had to provide a 50 whatever character username. So pretty niche bug. I think Okta, the code that was vulnerable to this was in production for like 3 months or something like that. Yeah. So, overall, like it's an embarrassing bug, but at the same time, like, I don't know that anyone I didn't know that about bcrypt.
No. And
been in this industry for a long time.
The other thing here too is someone needs to have previously logged in via Okta with that user, right? So when you're thinking about a username that's got 52 characters in it, it's got to be a service account, right? So what are the odds of a service account, like a service account bouncing out through Okta from your AD? So what are the chances that someone's actually used Okta, to authenticate that user? It's very, very low. So I think all in all, this is something that like never would have been really practical in the wild, but it's still not, as you point out, it's not a good look for an authentication company. I think another saving grace here too is, as you said, they introduced it on July 23rd, and by October 30th, they actually had it cleaned up. So that's a sign that their internal review, I guess, failed in the first instance, but caught it in the second instance, which I guess you'd call belt and suspender. But I think that one of the reasons I wanted to talk about this is just people were jumping on this like it was, affected all Okta SSO, and, like it was just the sky was falling. And it's not really that. It is a curiosity, but it's still an interesting one, right?
Yeah, it's definitely not as bad as some of the social media commentary that, as you say, I want to jump on Okta because, they have had a few clangers over the last couple of years, but this one was not one. If they did find it internally, and obviously code review should have picked this up ideally before it went into production rather than 3 months after, but they got there in the end, which is a lot better than when you think about all of the other vendors out there and how long some of those terrible bugs live for before they're found being used in the wild. I think Okta in this case overall comes out of this looking pretty reasonable.
Yeah, we'll give them a B, right? Not an A,
exactly,
but they still get a B. But I'm going to call you on something you just said there, which is, excuse me, they've had a few clangers. What were they? I mean, there's this perception out there that Okta's doing really badly. And it ties back to a couple of incidents where I just don't think it's substantiated. So there was the case where someone got into a third-party support, portal or whatever, and took a screen cap, and that was it. And that was reported as an Okta breach. And then there was the stuff affecting the casinos where an attacker was able to federate an external IDP into Okta and maintain persistence that way. But that also affected Entra. The difference is that Okta talked about it and Microsoft didn't. So look, some people are going to say, oh, Okta's a minor sponsor of risky business and that's why you're defending them. But I just think the perception doesn't quite match the reality. And I think that's another reason people jumped all over this, is because of that perception, that unearned reputation that Okta has right now of being sort of lax. I just don't think it's entirely fair.
I mean, I guess the one I was thinking of was one of the auth-0 bugs, which is that's an Okta acquisition rather than Okta themselves. But, that was a JWT algorithm none kind of bug, which, that I feel happy calling that a clanger. But I do think overall you're right that, Okta has been tarred with a brush that maybe hasn't been entirely fair.
Yeah, that's it. I think it's just they're one of those vendors everyone loves to hate because Okta is sort of seen like a tax on your budget. It's just money you got to pay, and people sort of grumble about it, which is fair enough. But no, I don't think they're a hideously run vendor from a security perspective. I mean, they're a big vendor. They're always going to make mistakes, but yeah. Anyway, moving on, and let's talk about some new features coming to Windows 11. Catalan reported on this for us today, and it's really interesting what they're doing. Essentially, in future versions of Windows 11, goodbye root, basically. Everything's going to be sudo. You will not be able to perform certain high privilege functions without sort of re-authenticating via a specified means first. And this is a great idea.
Yeah, we started to see some details because there was a Windows Canary build that has this functionality in it, and we're starting to see some people looking into it and digging up the details. Microsoft hasn't really talked super specifically about how it works, but essentially in Windows, you have a regular user level token inside an admin account that's used for normal things, and then you have a more privileged token that's used for authenticating admin level stuff, and that's when you do run as administrator to start a privileged process. That's what's going on behind the scenes. And basically what they're doing is moving that privileged token up into a whole nother user account. So it's more segregated from the regular admin session. So it is kind of like sudo in a Unix environment, as you say. And then there'll be a gate that you have to go through to do that. And it's kind of similar to how UAC, the user account control, which makes you click, yes, I would like to do admin stuff, worked, but this can now be used to require more authentication. And so ideally, multi-factor or biometric or U2F or some, because authentication is so much more flexible now as well. And as an adversary who lands in a privileged admin account, this is the sort of thing that is just going to make your life more complicated. And yeah, I'm totally here for that.
Yeah, it's like just-in-time admin for local accounts, right? And it's great, a really cool idea. And yes, before people jump in the comments, I am aware that the concept of root doesn't exist in Windows, but you know what I mean. I also twigged that we have a different pronunciation. For me, it's sudo because it's super user do, and for you, it's sudo.
Sudo, yeah.
Like judo.
I don't know why. That's just how it is.
That's just how it is, It's just one of those things, right? All right, so now we're going to talk about the big Sophos report that dropped late last week. This is a fascinating document. Basically, Sophos noticed that, some Sophos customers were getting owned, and the Sophos team were able to figure out that people were doing vulndev on a bunch of Sophos trial VMs. So in certain locations in China, and they've since tied this activity back to a couple of specific organizations, a university and a company in China that look like were doing exploit dev for the for Chinese APT operations. And what they did is they dropped like kernel level rootkits on these people to monitor them. Were able to get an early heads up on O-days, squash them, collect all sorts of amazing telemetry. And they did this over a period of 5 years. And now they've dropped a report on it. And it is, I mean, I am here for this.
Yeah, very, very much so. This was such an interesting story, and watching the takes of this story, amongst, InfoSec, social media, and, kind of around the various digital water coolers that we all hang out at. It's just been really, really interesting. So as you said, they dropped some kind of like kernel level monitoring implant on virtual machines that were being used for vuln research or exploit development, like weaponizing exploits, but also a physical appliance, physical device that this group had. And then, we're able to identify bugs that they were using, identify techniques, look at how they were chaining bugs together to weaponize them, and then deploy either countermeasures or signatures or try and understand what they were seeing out in the wild. And this is... it's really interesting because for a lot of people, this seems to be surprising, but yet when you compare it to what antivirus or EDR vendors do on Windows, where they have a whole bunch of telemetry, or even, operating system telemetry from Windows or from Apple iOS or whatever else, like this stuff gets hoovered up and reviewed and used by security conscious firms. And so seeing a firewall vendor or a network perimeter device vendor doing this just seems like a step in the right direction, despite, all of the hullabaloo it seems to have caused, amongst the commentariat.
Yeah, I mean, 100%, right? I mean, the thing that I can think of that's most similar is when Kaspersky wound up on a, computer full of NSA exploits and then extracted them and did threat hunting like that, right? Like, it's the same thing, but it's on a hardware device, and yet somehow this is regarded as controversial. I did a half-an-hour interview last night with Ross McKercher, who is the CISO of Sophos, to talk all about this. And I'm just going to play an excerpt here where he talks about some of these reactions we've seen, because some people have been quite critical of Sophos, saying, how dare they drop malware on their possible customer, which is, I just don't think is a particularly sensible take. But, Ross spoke really intelligently about all of that, and here's an excerpt of that now.
So yeah, I mean, by and large, I think the bad takes that we've seen have been pretty uninformed. There are some exceptions to that. I think the whole kind of hacking back debate is an interesting one to have. One thing that we've shown, I believe, is that it's not really a binary kind of you're doing it or you're not doing it. There's a lot of shades of grey in that debate. I'm glad we're having that debate because we do want to kind of establish cyber norms in that space. What the right way to operate is. I think we've pushed that envelope a little bit and shown that it's by and large that we're on the right side of history. We've had a lot of support from not on our explicit actions, but generally we think that organizations like CISA and NCSC, they're saying things like, we encourage vendors to take accountability and responsibility for customer security outcomes. We felt like, as long as we're kind of guided by those principles and following that kind of guidance, then it's probably going to be okay.
So there you go. That's Ross just sort of spelling out, I guess, his thoughts on what all of this means for hacking back and whatnot. And if you want to watch the full interview, I'm going to publish it to our YouTube channel. So just find Risky Business Media on YouTube, and I've put the whole thing there. You watched it this morning, Adam. I mean, I was really happy with that interview. I thought he was a terrific guest and said really interesting things.
Yeah, no, I really enjoyed that interview. Like, you touched on a bunch, all of the questions that we all had, because as you said, I think in it, we kind of all had questions in the internal Risky Biz Slack that you then, kind of used on in the interview. And yeah, like it just seems like a thing that a security vendor should be doing. And one of the things that he said, was that, as security vendors, you kind of have to pick a side at this point. And going after, in this case, Chinese exploit dev being used against Taiwan and being used against other, Western allies, like kind of what they should be doing, and the level of cooperation with law enforcement, with intelligence agencies, like reflects the reality of the world that we are now in. And anyone who thinks that, they have, anyone who has a vendor about which they have privacy concerns, like they want to be secret from their vendor, needs to adjust their threat model, because that's just not how the world works anymore. And deal with it.
Well, you and I were talking about this the other day, and I think you and I both have crash dumps turned on for our iOS devices, because you want failed exploit attempts being flagged and sent to Apple for their threat hunters to have a look at, because one day you might get an email or a phone call from someone at Apple saying, hey, someone's trying to own you. Like, this is the new reality. Like, it is a good thing. We used to, like 10, 20 years ago, we used to turn that stuff off. We don't want that data going anywhere. And now you just smash the hell yeah button, right?
And especially as companies have gotten better at handling that data. Like, I'm much more confident that memory dumps from my iOS devices are going to be treated with due respect at Apple, like both in terms of how their staff manage them, but also like how they just store them and how they, use them or whatever else. Whereas once upon a time, I am sure that, Dr. Watson crash dumps from Windows or whatever, we're just, kicking around a file share in Redmond. But, these days things have changed, and it's just not like it used to be. So, I would be a little more wary with less, mainline vendors, maybe the ones that haven't necessarily earned that respect yet. But the world is definitely not where it once was.
Well, Ross actually describes that. Well, he says some people are nervous about it on GDPR grounds, which he thinks is like kind of crazy when you think of the privacy benefit you get from, not getting owned. It's probably bigger than the privacy benefit you get by not sharing crash dumps. But again, people should go, absolutely go and check out that interview.
Hell yeah.
Okay, now we've got a write-up to look at, Adam. It's Bishop Fox's write-up of the FortiManager vulnerability that's been getting everyone owned. I just think this is a really interesting bug. And I mean, I know most of it is all done right now, like in terms of everything's been owned that's on the internet, but I still think it's worth looking at. I also had a really interesting chat yesterday with a gentleman by the name of Gert van der Berg, who works for an Australian sort of defense-focused consultancy called Subliminal. And thanks, Gert, for that, because I just wanted to understand how these things work. And it is kind of as crazy as you would expect. Like, the FortiManager thing sits out there at the edge, and it is both a client and a server, right? So it has to connect to the devices that it's managing, and those devices need to have sort of various open ports where this API-like thing sits there, and vice versa, right? So when a bug like this turns up, it's just real, real bad. And in this case, essentially how it works is that an attacker that could connect to a FortiManager appliance can just enroll their own device into it. And then from there, I think there was like a command execution vuln. So this is just really terrible, and a great reminder. I was chatting with another mutual friend of ours yesterday actually about this. It's a real reminder that I think we need to go back to first principles somewhat when looking at rolling out projects like this, because you can't put this stuff on the internet, right? Like management interfaces, management ports for firewall orchestrators. You can't put that stuff on the internet and not expect bad things to happen. And for some reason, I think a lot of people have forgotten that.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're very right. And the bit that the Bishop Fox write-up digs into is less about the actual command exec bug, and more about the process by which Fortinet tried to make it okay to put this stuff on the internet, which is to say they use certificate-based authentication. But in a management product like this, there's the whole like bootstrapping problem. How do you buy a new Fortinet, take it out of the box, and configure it with your FortiManager if it uses certificate auth? There are, in this case, factory certificates. And if you can show up to a FortiManager with any old signed by Fortinet cert, then you can, kind of start that enrollment process and expose all the extra attack surface that in this case leads to command injection. But from the point of view of an organization that's, say, doing vuln scanning, trying to understand their perimeter, all they see is a port that they get nothing back from because they don't have the relevant certs. But from an attacker's point of view, and indeed Bishop Fox's case, they said, we actually had some of these certificates lying around from previous work that we did. pulled them out of a VM, extracted them from a hardware device, whatever it was. And so this impairs defenders who can't understand what's exposed in their perimeter, but doesn't really impair attackers because we know how to get these certificates and so on. And this is a thing that we've seen in all sorts of other embedded device management platforms that have to do kind of over-the-air auto enrollment because they all end up having to trust something, and that something is having the software in the first place, which is a bar attackers can meet. So that was the thing I thought was really interesting about it.
But I mean, if you architect these things right, you don't need to have these things facing the internet. Do you know what I mean? You can VPN them in some other way, or, you know, there are ways to do this without exposing these ports to the internet. And I just think, given and I also spoke to Andrew Morris this week, right? And he says that the border device is getting owned at the moment. Like, even though it's a big story in the cybersecurity media, he's like, it is so much worse than people realize. Like, it is just crazy out there on the internet at the moment. And I think the only thing that's going to move the needle on this is to do better networking. Right? I mean, HD Moore in this week's sponsor interview said something really interesting, which is that one approach he recommends for dealing with this, just in terms of the problem of actual users connecting into these VPNs, a way to restrict that is you can actually export a list of all of the egress IPs of CrowdStrike clients, right? So any machine running CrowdStrike, you will be able to report its IP. You can pull that into an allow list, right? So that's one way to deal with this. But I think we are really on the cusp of having to seriously lock down like network. I mean, this is why I've been, you know, so big on knock and whatnot. And that's just a small part of this. I just think we're on the cusp of really having to change the way we think about even allowing network connections to just occur from anywhere, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. Firewalling is one of those controls that is simple and basically works, right? There's not much to go wrong with you can't talk here.
But we need to make it dynamic, I think, is the point.
Yeah, like being able to use those controls in ways that reflect the modern kind of like zero trusty mobile post-COVID working from home internet, but bringing the simplicity and, let's face it, the lack of complexity to controls, right, by using firewalls or whatever else, because we can't be trusted to write software. We can't be trusted to ship and deploy complicated systems that are reachable to adversaries because we're bad at computers. And, controls that actually work, like that's super valuable. And not forgetting that, you think about how many things we have been saved from because of IPv4 exhaustion and address translation.
Yeah.
It wasn't meant to be a security controller. Boy, oh boy, has it bought us a few years.
Yeah, it certainly has. Now let's look at Wired's report here. A bunch of outlets have covered this. A suspect has been arrested in Canada. He is suspected of being the Snowflake hacker, affiliated with the COM kind of thing. Alexander Connor Mooker has been arrested this week by Canadian authorities and, in all sorts of trouble. So I think you'd expect an extradition to the United States there. I think there is more coming on this story, but I'm going to be good and not talk about it until next week.
Very responsible of you, sir. Very responsible, yes. So I think this guy, we're going to see him in US custody, which is probably where he belongs. But by all accounts, he bought credentials from an infostealer and then used them against Snowflake and then, tried to turn that into embarrassment of money for people. So as hacking goes, not very hackery, but still definitely proper crimes. So yeah, let's hope he gets the book thrown at him.
Probably better described as an alleged computer criminal rather than a hacker, right?
Yes. Yeah.
It's a bit of an insult to the word hacker. Yeah. Now let's talk about the robots doing some hacking here, Adam, because we got two stories that relate to large language models that are actually really interesting. So John Grieg has a write-up at The Record about Google's one of Google's large language models actually finding a bug in SQLite, SQLite, and we've also got a report about Grey Noise discovering a 0-day in the wild that was targeting IP cameras with their SIFT LLM-based thing, which, we've had Andrew on the show talking about that before, but this is the first time they found a good one, went through the whole reporting process, so on and so forth. And indeed, he's going to be on the show in a couple of weeks talking about that. But, this is encouraging, right? When you're starting to see LLMs being used to actually find bugs in code and find bugs being used on the internet. I mean, I love it.
Yeah, no, it is encouraging. Although, before anyone gets too excited, like reading, Google wrote up the details of this on their Project Zero blog, and it has a bunch of the interactions with the LLM, like a bunch of the conversations and process. And it's a really good write-up because it talks through the challenges of getting the LLM to do the right thing, but then also what it was good at, what it wasn't, kind of where it made good contributions, kind of how it relates to fuzzing. They compare it quite strongly to, like, why wasn't this bug found with automated fuzzing? Because Google and their OSS fuzz project already does fuzz SQLite and didn't find this particular bug. So it's well worth a read for anyone who's kind of in the weeds of using LLMs for bug finding and bug hunting and so on. So yeah, I think, we're definitely making progress, and it is really interesting to see something proper in real world this way, but it's just not as broadly applicable yet as people want it to be, but it's a great step in the right direction.
Yeah, baby steps.
Yeah.
Baby steps. We're just starting here. And by the way, everyone, I'm aware I'm still coughing. Not much I can do about it. If I were to stop and try to record clean takes every time I cough, we'd be here all day. Still recovering. And thank you to people for their continued well wishes. Yes, I was very sick. But the grey noise one's cool, right? Because what they're doing is they've got their big honeypot network out there, and they're just seeing these attack attempts come in, and to be able to automatically extract an exploit out of that. And I think this was like a real deal command injection bug as well, affecting, and these weren't like little, cheap home cameras. These were serious business IP cameras at sensitive facilities and whatnot. And probably the attackers were trying to just use them as orbs, but being able to stop that in its tracks, to be able to detect a bug like that and just have an LLM write it up, I think that's just an amazing achievement.
Yeah, like I could certainly imagine at the kind of volume that grey noise has to deal with, having anything that's going to help sift through it, dig stuff out, and automate, part of this process, the triage, super valuable. So yeah, solid work there.
Yeah, now speaking of orbs, we've got a write-up here from Ars Technica about TP-Link routers being used, as orbs by the Chinese to really obscure the origin of attacks. I mean, this is something that's come up a few times. We've been talking about this a bit, but really, it's a good way to roll, right? Like, it's the old way to roll, which is you have a compromised, end user device and you stage your attacks from there because it just looks like a normal home IP. But it's a good write-up here, and there's some nice details in here.
Yeah, and I think the thing that stood out to me about this one was that Microsoft wrote up this campaign because it was being used to do low and slow brute force against Azure and Microsoft, kind of identity services. And vendors like Microsoft, really big ones like that, are in a position to spot really scaled low and slow campaigns like this. And I think writing them up and talking about them publicly is just super useful, because everybody else who's too small to spot really low volume spraying distributed very widely, we have to rely on the big people with really big viewports into the internet to be able to warn us about this stuff. So yeah, good work, Microsoft, for once.
Indeed. Hey, that's a bit harsh. Like, their threat people are pretty good. Their threat people are excellent. Our criticism of Microsoft is very much around the the products, not the people doing this sort of work, right?
Sorry, Microsoft people that do good work.
Yeah. Now let's look at it's not dumb if it works. We've got this Midnight Blizzard attack targeting people with like malicious RDP like config files. Is that about right?
Yeah, exactly. This is it's smart because it's dumb and it works. They've been emailing people around with a phishing lure that is an RDP file that is associated with the Windows Remote Desktop software. And if you click on it to launch, it will prompt you to connect to some server on the internet via Remote Desktop. Many people don't understand that Remote Desktop can also share local resources like drives and printers and whatever else with the remote server. And so this was set up to basically share your C drive or whatever with the server after auth. And so the attackers in question were then using that drive access to pivot back down into the local machine, infect it with malware, and then onwards to come out of your machine and great victory, which is pretty smooth. Like, I've definitely thought about doing this before, but it's one of those things where you just look and think like, no one's going to respect me in the lunchroom, if I'm going to try and hit my target by convincing the double click on an RDP file, I have to go find a better bug. But, I guess if it's your actual job, as opposed to just, something you're doing to try and look clever in the lunchroom, then, it gets it done.
I remember like 15 years ago chatting with, I think it was Brett Moore, who was your boss, technically, at Insomnia, at an early KiwiCon. And I think you can do similar things over Citrix. You can like remote mount drives and stuff like that. Yeah, I had no idea, right? So that's why, because I think he was presenting on some Citrix stuff. Was that him who did that Citrix Gateway talk? Like, what was that, like 2008 or something? Yeah, an amazing talk.
Yep.
Like using Notepad, like remotely served, unauthorized Notepad to get great victory, like through Citrix. And then, talking to him after that, he's like, oh yeah, you can mount drives, you can do this, you can do that, you can print stuff if you want. You're just wait,
printer
what?
sharing. There's all sorts of microphones if you want to hot mic people. There's just, it's super useful. It's good times.
So I mean,
we shared a lot of things over the years like that, Insomnia.
So I guess it's worth pointing out that Thin Client, can probably do a little bit more than just remotely display a screen. And I think a lot of people don't know that. So yeah. So as dumb as that is, it's like, it's sort of like forgotten knowledge.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, I really enjoy, smart dumb hacking. It's the way.
Yeah. Now, we got this other write-up here. We'll go with the record version. James Reddick has the write-up. It's about Chinese intrusions into government agencies. I mean, this is all, so far so normal stuff. But then we've got interesting stuff here. It's all Canada this week, right? Because it turns out Canadian officials, it looks like, were maybe leaking some SIGINT to the Washington Post about senior figures in India greenlighting assassination attempts or assassinations on Canadian soil of like Sikh separatists. And then you've got bodies in Canada releasing threat reports saying that, India is now a like cyber adversary. Things have just got hot, right? So, for those who haven't been following, like the diplomatic relations between India and Canada have been deteriorating over this assassination plot, and it's just getting bad. And I do think it's interesting that when you've got these national threat assessments coming out, when you've got these bureaucrats basically saying, and I'm not using bureaucrat as a pejorative, they're bureaucrats, basically saying, yeah, look, India is now our adversary in the cyber domain. It's just amazing how quickly that all turned around.
Yeah, it has moved very quickly. And, when we see, like there's been so much talk about, say, like iPhone production, with Foxconn in China being moved to Malaysia, moved to India, and doing that because India is seen as more stable, seen more as geopolitically aligned with the West, etc. It's funny how quickly that kind of thing can change. And, as InfoSec professionals, we're always thinking about, how do we manage supply chain risk? How do we manage our exposure to geopolitical realities? And it can move so quickly. But, what are you supposed to do when it's on the time frame of like, can I buy, iPhones made in India now if you're a Canadian, supplier to the Canadian government or whatever? Like, it doesn't take much to look, if this gets worse, another 3 months worse, another 6 months worse, what would that mean for people having to, buy hardware, buy software? Yeah, it's just hard to keep track of, So
things can change quick.
They can.
Right? Things can change
real quick. That's why we've become so much a geopolitical podcast as well as a tech one, right?
Well, on that topic, we've got a great report here from Wired, which really looks back into a, failed regime change attempt by the Americans targeting Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela. And the reason we're talking about it here is it looks like there was a cyber element of this. The reporting is a little bit vague on exactly how this happened, but it looks like the Americans were able to actually shut down the payroll system for Venezuelan soldiers. And this was seen as a way of, generating some discontent there in concert with other activities. As we all know, these attempts failed, and Nicolas Maduro is still very much in charge in Venezuela, sadly. But it's an interesting read nonetheless, right? And it's a little bit of an insight into, how governments can use some of these techniques to try to tilt power one way or the other.
Yeah, I thought it was a really fascinating read. I mean, A, because of the kind of cyber angle, which is in our beat, but also B, the extent to which it's clear that the CIA really didn't want to have to do what it was being asked to, like their reluctance to get all Bay of Pigs up in there, or, put, operatives on the ground in Venezuela to do things, and how cyber was kind of seen as a way to, have some effect, like enough that they could claim that they were doing what, the President Trump had told them to do, but, without it really turning into something particularly effective. And like, that's just, when you imagine what the American national security bureaucracy is like, A, sounds super believable, and B, it's just kind of a funny about face from the CIA that, you read about in the spy novels and so on. But yeah, it's just, I think it's a good read for anyone who follows, sort of the intersection of NatSec and cyber.
And there's some juicy little details in there as well, where the people who are running this operation were trying to get access to better resources on the cyber side from within CIA and NSA, and they got told to pound sand, basically. So you get the impression that like the entire sort of, IC bureaucracy was not marching as one on this one.
Yeah, well, exactly. Yeah. And then once John Bolton was one of the main kind of architects of this, and once he got pushed out.
John Bolton, the walrus.
Yes. The kind of wheels all fell off, and then onwards from there. But it's just, I think this is a good read. If you're looking for something to read in your lunchtime, this is our recommendation of the week from Risky Business.
Now we're going to talk about some reporting from our colleague Catalin Kimpanu, which looks at recent goings on at Mango Park in Cambodia, which is where a lot of these sort of, scam compounds and whatnot operate. There's been arrested workers and some strange goings on with the Cambodian government. Can you walk us through this, Adam?
Yeah, so the basic gist of this is that a South Korean got, lured into working at the scam, kind of offered a high-profile job or high-paying job in Cambodia, gets their passport taken away, imprisoned at Mango Park and forced to do cyber scamming. Eventually, his family in Korea paid a ransom for him to be released. He went back to South Korea, kicked up a hullabaloo, and that led to a South Korean television station doing kind of an expose about it. And that was sufficiently embarrassing for the Cambodian government that they actually then went and raided the compound, et cetera, et cetera. Then where it kind of gets interesting is that the result of this was a bunch of people have been, freed, and no one's quite clear whether they're being, kind of repatriated or have just been sent back to the compound or whatever else. And there's been a bunch of kind of downplaying and cover-uppiness from Cambodian authorities. And we've seen previous reports about the kind of the tie-ins between Cambodian officials, Cambodian leadership, all the way up to kind of the top levels of government, with both the company that was providing kind of money laundering services, but also the scam compound operators themselves. And, the kind of overall vibe is that, Cambodia as a state has kind of been captured by the sheer scale of the scamming business. And then, that's been turning into a mess for everybody, both the people, running the scams, people imprisoned, the people being scammed, the governments of the countries, whose citizens are involved. Real mess. And it's going to take a while for us to, see any real resolution here, because there's just so much money involved. Yeah,
I mean, it's Cambodia, Myanmar, and Laos where the bulk of this activity happens. And I think they're earning, these scam compounds, something equivalent to 40% of the combined GDP of those countries.
Yeah, it's the scale.
That's right. And anytime you've got numbers that are that out of whack, you've got kind of a Colombia in the 80s situation where the crime is worth so much money that the crime groups become immensely powerful and start to co-opt politicians. So that's one of the things that makes this so insidious, is it's so profitable that they're going to get top cover from governments, which is why I think the response so far from the EU and the United States to this has been about right, because we've just seen sanctions flying involving these scam compounds. I think this is one tool that the West can use to try to put a lid on this stuff. I don't know how effective they'll be on their own, but I feel like gradually things are going to ramp up, and we might see some, more offensive cyber-style operations against these compounds, because they rely on an awful lot of bandwidth to do this sort of stuff. They rely on an awful lot of internet to do their cyber scamming, and that's something that can be taken away remotely fairly easily. And I just wonder how long it'll be before we get to that point.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, we've seen, some of the people who do it sort of at an amateur level on YouTube, like doing the breaking into Indian scam call centers, for example, and publishing their video, feeds from their security cams and outing them, like that kind of thing on a larger scale against some of these compounds would be interesting to see. But it's just, seeing this happening at, as you said, like tens of billions of dollars scale, it's just kind of different than anything we've really seen before. I mean, the scale of ransomware is what, like single digit low billions, and we're talking tens of billions here.
Yep.
Like it's massive. So,
well, ransomware is disruptive, but it's never been the earner. It's BEC and scams. That's what makes the money. But I guess they're less cyber these days. And it's just amazing how they've refined these scams, because these days, like, you don't even need mule accounts to run a scam like this. You just get people to buy crypto from some exchange, right? And then send it to you, and that's it. You've got the money. So yeah, it's hard. I mean, I'd like to see these places getting DOSed. I would like to see their upstream ISPs suffer as well. I mean, why not sanction the upstream ISPs that give these people connectivity? That might get you somewhere. I think these are the sort of approaches that we need to think about to try to combat this fraud. But it's horrible stuff. We're going to finish with a story from Jonathan Grigg over at The Record. He never did get back to us on whether it's Greg or Greg, by the way. But apparently a crew in North Korea, the North Korea's Reconnaissance General Bureau, were involved in a attack involving the Play ransomware. So, I mean, that's good news, everyone. North Korea just operating like any other affiliate. If they really, and we've been saying this like all year, if they really decide to branch out hard into ransomware, that's going to be bad.
Yeah, this was based on some reporting from Palo Alto's Unit 42, which saw a case where the North Koreans had been in there, and then after they'd been in for a while, the Play ransomware was delivered through the same mechanism, so like through the same user accounts on the same entry points, and it very much looked like one had introduced the other, like that the North Koreans had brought the Play crew or had deployed the Play ransomware, either by selling access or deploying it themselves. And yeah, it's a tie-up I guess we've all been expecting to happen. And yeah, maybe this is the hot collaboration of the season. North Koreans bringing the good ransomware and onwards from there, rather than just fake rubbish stuff. So yeah, innovation maybe.
All right, mate. Well, that's actually it for the news this week. Thank you so much for joining me. And again, apologies to listeners for my coughing through this interview. I hope to be 100% real soon. But yeah, we'll pick it all up again next week. Adam, thanks again.
Yeah, thanks very much, Pat. I will talk to you then.
That was Adam Boileau there with a check of the week's security news. It is time for this week's sponsor interview now with HD Moore, who is the co-founder and chief executive of RunZero, which is an excellent sort of chasm product. It does like attack surface measurement and all of that good stuff, so it can find stuff that you own that's out there on the internet that shouldn't be there. And HD's joining me to talk about some new tricks that RunZero has, where it can actually marry internal scan data from the inside of your environment to external scan data. So you can really know that this thing you're seeing on the inside is that thing that you're seeing on the outside. So he's going to talk through how RunZero is doing that. Here he is.
So the biggest challenge with external attack surface management is knowing where to start. So you need to attribute your entire external IP space, domains, third parties, everything that basically comes back into your organization. And the tricky thing about that is you'll be able to know some of it, and you'll be able to use tools and other techniques to get a handle on a lot of it, but you'll never get all of it. And that's the biggest challenge. So the idea is that because we already have great data about your entire internal environment, we can then precisely fingerprint an internal asset and be able to use that to find it on the internet anywhere, regardless of attribution. So we don't need to know what your external IP space is to figure out whether you've got a workstation with RDP exposed to the internet.
I'd imagine that is useful context as well, right? So when you find something outside and you're like, that's bad. Currently, I mean, I know people have used, this sort of software, these sorts of scans to find stuff on the outside, and they're like, okay, that thing shouldn't be there. But then they don't know who it belongs to, who's managing it, right? Whereas I'd imagine once you've got the internal scan data, you would have a better starting point at least, or am I off base there?
No, that's exactly right. Half the time when you get an external attack surface report, you're like, great, this thing's exposed, but what is it? How's it connected? What can someone do when they get there? When you're starting off from the internal side and you have the full context of your chasm and overlays of your EDR, et cetera, you know exactly what it is. You know exactly what data it has access to, where it lives in the network, what it's connected to, and what the risk of it actually being exposed is. One of the neat things we can do as well is actually identify, is this machine, so let's say we see the same cryptographic cert on an internet-facing asset and an internal asset. There's a bunch of different scenarios that could play out. One is that machine is directly exposed. Two, the machine has been cloned. So someone took a copy of an internal workstation and put it in AWS as an AMI. Three, that key is actually widely copied all over the place. So it doesn't really matter like which one of those outcomes it is. You've got a problem somewhere. So we're able to tell you, either 1, 2, or 3 pretty quickly if you see anything exposed. So it may not be directly connected to the internet, but it could be a copy of a machine that was directly connected to the internet, or a clone of a machine that's actually pretty important.
Well, I think what you're getting at is it's something worth looking into.
Absolutely. So it's really no false positives, which is the great part about it. If you see a machine internally that has the same fingerprint, if you will, on the external side, you've got a problem somewhere. It's either a cryptographic problem, it's an exposure problem, or it's a hard-coded weak firmware key problem.
So talk to me about how this actually works, right? Because you're talking about doing detailed enough fingerprinting on the inside that you can know that that's the same asset that you're seeing from the outside. How can you get a fingerprint that works in both directions? Because I would imagine some of the stuff that enables you to do high quality fingerprinting on the inside, I don't know. I mean, you might be accessing more ports on the inside than are accessible externally, or, does it need to present externally the same way it does internally? Or how do you marry those fingerprints when sometimes you've got access to more information on the inside?
Yeah, I mean, the good news is most of the remote access protocols you're going to care about have built-in encryption. And they've got built-in encryption, they've got a hard-coded crypto key of some sort, a public key that rotates every so often, or and so on. So you can use the fingerprint of the encryption key or the public key of the asset, whether it's an SSH host key or a TLS fingerprint, to get pretty close to truth. You can say, at least it's the same public key on the same machine, right? Now the question is it actually the same machine? So there's a bunch of techniques you can use for that. So crypto keys aren't the only way we do it, but to give an example of one that's not a crypto key, SNAP version 3 allows you to leak what's called the engine ID pre-authentication. This is a opaque kind of hex value that also often includes the MAC address of the machine. So, it's true you can have the same hard-coded MAC across multiple routers, but in reality, when we scan the whole internet, we see that these things are almost unique per physical hardware. However, if they're not the same per physical hardware, we got ways to tell them apart. So in addition to the engine ID leaking out, there's also a bunch of counters. So if we hit the counters on the internal side and say the counter is currently 35, and then we do something to bump it up to 36, then we query the external side and say, is it currently 36? Bang on, you know exactly that it's that physical asset. And if it's not, it's a copy of that asset. So we can use the same
so you're
type
actually
of thing
making changes on the inside and waiting for them to pop up on the outside. That makes a lot of sense.
It's other attributes of the protocol you can leak out. So, RDP, for example, even though you've got a TLS certificate, which has, the common name, expiration date, serial number, all this great stuff you can fingerprint, you can also start the end-to-end SSP authentication process and leak out the DNS domain name and some other bits about the authentication handshake, which you can then use to confirm that it's the same machine. So most protocols, like SMB is another good example. There's 2 or 3 unique values in the SMB session that are, monotonically incrementing on that particular server. So if you see the session ID bumping up within a certain range, it's the same physical box.
Yeah, right. So, I understand that this isn't released yet. This is going to be early December release, but I'd imagine you would have some beta testers out there who are using this. What sort of stuff are they turning up with it, right? Because normally when I talk to someone like yourself who's released a new feature like this, they will say, we created this feature for all of these use cases, but this one is killer. Like, is there anything there that people are just going, oh my God, like, this has turned out to be very useful in this specific situation?
That's a good question. So we haven't released it to a big beta group yet. We've been using it internally and doing a lot of kind of like boil the ocean research to figure out, what percentage of customers have particular exposure. And we're doing it in a way that's kind of like the, have I been pwned model, where we're not taking like internal data and pushing it out to the internet, right? We're taking a database of the whole internet and then querying a hash of that against an internal only service so that we're not having to like leak information from internal systems out to any kind of third party hosted service. So in doing it that way, we're able to quickly say like, does this partial hash of this internal server exist in the public database? Yes or no? And what we found so far is like, obviously you find lots of misconfigurations, lots of hard-coded MAC addresses, things like that. But we are seeing cases where there's crypto keys that were previously unknown to be, widely shared across customers are there. So they're popping up out of the weeds immediately. We see those everywhere. That's kind of like step one, is look for any duplication across more than one customer. If you see more than one in one place, like it's already a problem. Dig into it, figure out why.
Why is that happening?
It's usually lazy vendors. It's an appliance that has a hard-coded key. It's a firmware.
Yeah, okay.
It's a lot of systems where just it has either the key always gets generated a certain way because of the way the RNG is, or it's hard-coded to the firmware itself. Those ones are easy. So we take all those out of the equation, throw them away, and say, great, those are ones that we can flag as being weak crypto key, but not emergency. Now, what else is out there? And this is where we're starting to find the really fun stuff. So we're finding a lot of cases where an internal core router that's responsible for like segmenting like PCI network from non-PCI is also internet facing with SNMP exposed. And
Whoops.
yeah, you don't expect it to be quite that prominent. Like, it's amazing how many what should be internal networking devices have external attack surface. And that's probably been the biggest surprising so far.
And how are people usually, and I know that these particular features aren't out there yet, but I'd imagine people are already using just like the external discovery component to find that sort of thing. What are they generally doing when they, like, how successful are they at actually cleaning up stuff that gets discovered by Chasm? Because that's always something that I've wondered about, because, you know, Chasm's a great thing to do, right? It's great to do some external, you know, attack surface mapping and all of that. But sometimes people get a list of 100 things and they, you know, they're limited in what they can do, right? So like 50 of them, okay, boneheaded stuff like you just described, just nuke it off the internet. But other stuff might be a little bit more tricky. Like, what, you know, how successful are people at dealing with the results of external scanning, I guess is the question.
I guess that's kind of my claim for why you need to have the internal side as well and the kind of full Chasm picture is because if you're starting with external only, all you have is like, okay, when is machine exposed, or we see SH exposed. You don't really know if it matters. So the nice thing about the Chasm piece is you can overlay your vuln management data, your EDR data, all your internal controls on top of that and say, okay, this device is exposed but doesn't have an EDR on it. Does it actually have access to this network? Does it have a critical vulnerability? So you can start really narrowing down how much you have to care about that exposure with that other data.
Right. So it's not just this thing is vulnerable, it's this thing is vulnerable, unmanaged, and has access to a lot of stuff, which, yes, is more of a 5-alarm fire.
Yeah. And for anything else, like let's say you do have a jump box that's RDP and you know it's exposed, that's fine, right? You know it's contained to your VDI environment or something like that. It's not the end of the world if that's hanging out on the internet because of the way it's set up. But then again, if you see a machine that absolutely should not be on the internet, you know, an executive laptop where it's got a LTE card and RDP is exposed to a random IPv6 address, that's a bigger issue.
So talk to me too, because it's been a while since we've had you on the show. Talk to me too about just some broader trends in the way people are using RunZero, because you always have an interesting answer there.
Probably the most surprising trend in the last year is just the amount of OT interest. You know, so for us, like we always treat OT like anything else. We scan safely. We do so many things to make sure we don't impact the end device, the local broadcast segment, middle devices between us and the device we're talking to. We rolled out passive detection last year, which made it easier for folks to just upload PCAPs or do span port monitoring if they weren't comfortable doing full-on scanning. But we've seen a huge increase of people scanning OT environments in the last 6 months alone. That's probably been the biggest trend. We've also seen
that's interesting, because I remember when you released that stuff, and it was safe, right? You could scan an OT environment and not make robots go crazy, right? Which is fantastic. But you did hit a lot of resistance in the market where people just didn't want to actively scan. So then you released passive tools, and what, now you're saying they're coming around?
That's kind of what we figured too. We figured putting the passive discovery out there wasn't necessarily because people were going to use it. It's because they can use it to build trust and then use the active. That's exactly what happened.
Yeah. So what sort of OT environments? Just general, all sorts, or?
You know, manufacturing, like everything from automotive. We've got a few customers in that space, telcos, all the way down to like warehousing, logistics. One of my favorite customers runs a fish farm. And so out in the middle of like the Mediterranean, there's a bunch of cameras and stuff kind of turning around, and you're looking at some fish and some feeders and some cameras, and RunZero monitors all that. So it's a really wide variety, but I just love how much stuff is out there and the fact that we're able to basically provide really detailed data about those assets that you just can't really get any other way.
Look, just going back to a question I had earlier, just about how you can't, you know, it's great to have ASM, but, you know, you can't necessarily take stuff down even after you've discovered these vulnerable things on the edge of the network. I mean, one of the issues here is actually security devices on the outside that need to be accessible, or your Fortinets and, you know, sonic walls and whatnot. Do you have any sense of, like, first of all, do people already always know that they're using those things, or are they having to discover them using discovery tools? And then secondly, what are they doing in response to that? Because that is a real pickle at the moment for people.
Yeah, it's a great question. So usually the security team or IT team realize they have at least one of these devices. So let's say it's a Palo Alto with SLVPN. They know they have it because that's how they connect to the network. They've got an SLVPN client. What typically they don't know about is the backup connection. They've got a failover. They've got a secondary one. They've one hooked up to a small office someplace. So it's one thing to know you've got a particular technology in place. It's another to know exactly where each of those instances of that appliance are. And it's really easy to forget your backup line or your secondary appliance.
So what are they doing when they've then discovered this backup appliance that maybe doesn't have the correct monitoring controls, things on it that way? Like, what do they do? Do they just then firewall that? And then, if they need the backup, they can unfirewall it? Like, what do you even do then?
I mean, typically what folks will do is turn off the backup options, only have one device left exposed, and then monitor the hell out of it. But if you listen to the vendors, what they recommend is putting another device in front of it of the same make, which doesn't make any sense.
No, it doesn't. It doesn't. I mean, I've talked to you about it before, but I'm a big fan of like knock knock for that particular application because you can actually cut it off. Which I don't understand. And I don't understand why it's up to a third-party vendor to, like, why on earth, when we live in a world with SSO, would you not instrument network connections based on SSO status? It makes no sense to me that they're not doing it. But hey, it's an opportunity for other people, right?
There's a great shortcut for it too. So if you're in a position where you have a VPN device, you need to have a list of IPs that allow access to it, and you need to get that list really quickly. Go to your EDR and export the public IPs of all your assets and you're done. It's literally a 2-second process. Go and RunZero, search for CrowdStrike, export the egress IP of all your CrowdStrike assets, stick that in your allow list, and you don't have to worry about it until Monday.
That's a really nice idea, actually. I like that one. That's great. And you can update them. You should be able to instrument that dynamically too.
Yeah, absolutely. You can export it directly out as a CSV from RunZero, pick the fields you want, pass it into your IP ACL. It should be pretty easy to automate. But I mean, the nice thing is you already have the data. It's already sitting there on your EDR side. Just pull it in and use that as your allow list because you know who those clients are.
Yeah, that's a great idea. That's a fantastic idea. All right, HD Moore, thank you so much for joining me for that conversation. Always great to see you.
Thanks for having me, Patrick.
That was HD Moore, the chief executive of this week's sponsor, RunZero. Big thanks to him for that. And RunZero is a terrific tool and you should all absolutely go and check it out. But that is it for this week's show. I do hope you enjoyed it. I'll be back soon with more risky business for you all. But until then, I've been Patrick Gray. Thanks for listening and watching.